All right. So as you were introduced to, we're not going to talk a lot about Mr. Bell today. We're going to talk more about the ladies in his life, or at least some of them. Specifically his mother, his wife. I will mention a little bit about his two daughters. And then I'm going to finish up with one of the women in his life that I actually got to meet, which was his granddaughter, Dr. Mabel Grosvenor. All of these people had an amazing influence on his life, and especially his mother and his wife. Without them, chances are he wouldn't have gone down the road that he did in terms of inventing, pursuing the idea of solving problems. They both had an amazing influence. So we're going to start with his mother. Her name was Eliza Grace Simons before she was married. She was born in 1809 in Fortin, England, and she was the daughter of a naval surgeon with the Royal Navy, Dr. Samuel Simons, and his second wife, Mary White. The Simons had one daughter, Eliza, and four sons. Eliza was the oldest. And as she was growing up, she really started to exhibit her artistic side. And when she was 9 years old, her father passed on his own paint box to her. He was also an artist. And at this point in time, as a doctor or a surgeon, you actually had to be able to draw to a certain degree to illustrate what you had found during a surgery or a procedure or something like that. So he had this wonderful paint box and he passed it on to Eliza. The paint box still exists. The Bell descendants still have it to this day. We're holding out. We're hoping that someday they pass it on to us here at the museum. But Eliza started painting at a fairly young age. She typically painted in watercolor, and she always had sketchbooks. She carried a sketchbook practically everywhere she went. And in fact, this portrait of her that you see here is one of her self-portraits. So this would be after she was married, definitely. So she's probably in her mid-30s, early 40s, something like that. But if we move ahead, I'm going to be showing you some other pieces that she did as well as we go along. But here at the museum, this is the one painting that we have of hers that we absolutely revere. We consider it her best work, and it is her portrait of her three boys. So to give you some background, Eliza, in her time, would have been thought of as a spinster. If you, as a young lady, reached the age of 25 and you weren't married, you were immediately titled a spinster. And this is why women of that period aspired at a very young age to marry and start having a family. They did not want to be called a spinster. The spinsters of the family ultimately were the ones that ended up looking after their parents as they aged in their dotage. And you didn't want to be that if you could avoid it. Eliza probably had accepted the fact that she was a spinster. She and her mother were living in Edinburgh at this point in their lives. Her one brother was still in Edinburgh. The other three had moved to Australia. And Eliza was actually supporting she and her mother as a portrait painter. So she was selling her paintings, which is unusual for the period. Women of this period, they got married, they had a household, they raised children. They did not have a career outside of that. Eliza did. She was a little bit ahead of her time in that respect. So she was essentially a miniature painter. So she would actually do ivory miniatures, again, all in watercolor, but she also did wonderful landscapes. And then what we have here, her portrait of her three boys. So again, going back a little bit before this painting, Eliza had resigned herself to spinsterhood. And then at age 34, she was introduced to this young gentleman named Alexander Melville Bell by a mutual friend. He was 10 years younger than she was, but he was almost immediately enamored with her. And it wasn't love at first sight by any means, but he found her very charming. He found her very delightful, kind, and in writing a description of his future wife, Melville Bell wrote, "It was not exactly a case of love at first sight, but it was a case of struck at first sight. I found the lady very pretty, slim and delicate looking, and with the sweetest expression I think I ever saw. But she was deaf and could only hear with the help of an ear tube. My sympathy was deeply excited, but she was so cheerful under her affliction that sympathy soon turned to admiration. So Melville Bell was at that time an elocutionist. We might call him a speech therapist today. He and his brother David were working with their own father to help people that had speech impediments, but at the same time, Melville was quite interested in helping those that had hearing loss as well, not helping them hear again, but learn how to use their voices as opposed to signing. And so Eliza clearly struck a chord with him. They began courting, and a year later they were married in 1844. And within that first year of marriage, she became pregnant with their first son, Melville James Bell, followed in 1847 by their second son, Alexander, followed a year later in 1848 by their youngest son, Edward Charles. And what you see here is a portrait of the three boys, painted at the time that Alexander was probably about 7 years old. So the elder brother Melville is on the left, or Melly, as he was known to the family, again named after his father. Now his middle name was James, after Eliza's brother, then Alexander, and then Edward Charles. Edward and Charles were two of Eliza's brothers. You'll notice I didn't mention a middle name for Alec, as he was better known to the family. He was named after his grandfather, Alexander Bell, who also didn't have a middle name. When Alec was 11, he decided he needed a middle name. He wanted to distinguish himself from his father and his grandfather, who were both Alexanders. And so he asked if he could adopt the name Graham, which was the surname of a family friend whose name was Alexander Graham. He rather liked the way it sounded, and his parents agreed he should have a middle name. So that is how he became Alexander Graham Bell. So here the boys are dressed very typically of the period. Eliza would have followed convention at the time. Young boys wore dresses just as girls did until they were about 9 or 10 years old, when they could start wearing long pants. So at this point, both Alec and Ted are still in their dresses. And here's a photograph taken at what was called Milton Cottage, which was a summer residence that Melville rented outside of Edinburgh. And here are the three boys with Eliza and Melville. What I find interesting is that you really can't tell that there's 10 years between Melville and Eliza. And he was absolutely devastatingly in love with her. And it showed in how he looked after her, how he treated her, and how he reacted to her loss of hearing as well. He never treated her as someone disabled. She didn't wish to be treated that way, and he lived up to whatever she wanted to do in terms of how she communicated. She did continue to speak, of course, but she never learned sign language. She did learn to fingerspell as her hearing loss became worse. She actually started to lose her hearing at age 13 from ear infections. This was all before antibiotics. So unfortunately for Eliza, the ear infections damaged her inner ear. And from that point on, she required a hearing aid, or in their time, a hearing trumpet, which she carried with her everywhere she went. It must have seemed absolutely amazing to her that at age 35, she married this gentleman 10 years her junior, and then went on to have three boys. So in this photograph, Alec is on the left, Melly is in the middle at the back, and Edward, or Ted, is on the right. If you look at Ted, he's not the healthiest looking boy. He actually looks a little bit like he's ailing. And unfortunately, at age 18, he contracted tuberculosis, which was rampant at the time in Scotland and England. The Bells were still in Edinburgh at this point. There were no vaccines to prevent TB. There were no antibiotics. With factories and industrialization starting in the In the big cities in the UK, Edinburgh and London, there was already air pollution, and unfortunately, Ted didn't survive. About 3 years later, Melly, the oldest, started showing signs of the illness. His son, he had married, he was 25 at the time. He and his wife, Carrie, had a son who died at age 2 from tuberculosis. And now Melly was showing signs of the illness. By this point, Melville and Eliza had settled in Alec's grandfather's home in London on Harrington Square. Melly and his wife, Carrie, moved to London to be with them as his illness progressed, and he passed away there in June of 1870. At this point, Alec was 23. He was starting to ail a bit. He was looking poorly. He had severe headaches. His parents were beside themselves. They had lost 2 sons, they had lost a grandson, and now it looked as though the only surviving was starting to go downhill as well. So they immediately made the decision to get Alec out of England, out of Scotland, and that is when they came to Canada and settled here in August of 1870. And they purchased a 10.5-acre farm. And this is Eliza's portrait of the homestead while they were living here. Now, take a good look, because for years working here, I've been here now 35 years. And for many years, I had people coming to me saying, you're ruining the place, because we were trying to take it back to the farmstead look that it had in the Bell's time. It was a 10.5-acre farm. It was not Downton Abbey. This was not a home with servants on every floor. This was an upper middle class family with a small farm and a father who was teaching from home, helping his students speak better. It was a very rural landscape, as you can see by Eliza's portrait. Really, you can't even see the front veranda of the house, partially because Melville planted grapevines on it that completely enveloped it. But Eliza loved painting landscapes, and this is from one of her sketchbooks that we have here at the museum. I would imagine for her, moving to Canada in 1870 at age 60 was quite the thing. This is a lady who had never left the UK. She had lost 2 sons and a grandson. Her mother was back in Scotland battling breast cancer, but she was determined to save Alec. And so made the trip, settled into a very countrified house as opposed to living in the city, which they were used to. And it's so much fun reading the letters that Eliza wrote during that period. Alec did spend the first 8 months here with his parents resting and was quite well by the next spring rather, and he accepted a teaching position with the Boston School for the Deaf in Massachusetts. So for the first time, Eliza was literally without all 3 of her sons. And so Alec always received a weekly letter from his mother while he was in Boston, telling him what was happening here at the farm and news from overseas from family and friends, and being a mother, telling him how to dress and how to eat and how much money he should be spending on things, and giving her homeopathic remedies for his own ailments. And those letters are what we have used to recreate her household here. She gives wonderfully colorful descriptions of home to her son. And we feel very confident now that if she were to come back, she could walk through the front door of the homestead and feel very much at home. This is another of her paintings. This is the back of the farm. That's the Grand River running behind the homestead in their day. The area down by the fence, which, believe it or not, Melville built himself, is what Alec used to call his dreaming place. So in the afternoons in the summer, that is where he would go after noontime dinner to work out his ideas. That is where he discovered the basic principle for the telephone in 1874. And Eliza has captured it incredibly well here, clearly in the autumn. The picture that you see on the screen does not do the original justice. Her colors are absolutely gorgeous. In one of her letters, she wrote to Alec, they had a view across the river. You could actually see right into town. And there was a major fire on Colburn Street, and she and Melville stood on the landing on the stairs watching Colburn Street go up in flames from their vantage point. So it was a spectacular spot for them to be living. And this is what she looked like while she was here. And if you look closely on her lap, she has her hearing trumpet right there. She was not too proud to carry her hearing aid everywhere she went. One end appears like a funnel, the other end she would put in her ear, and as you were talking to her, you would speak into it for her. Now, growing up, Alec hated talking to his mother through a black rubber tube. So when he was 10 years old rather, his father challenged him to figure out a way of speaking to his mother without the hearing trumpet. He did some experimenting and he learned that if he pressed his lips against her forehead and spoke in his normal voice, she could understand what he was saying. Not from the sound, but from the vibration. And that was the first time he really understood that every sound is a vibration, which with more reading and more research and more experimenting eventually led him to believe that even someone born deaf could be taught how to talk. That is how he communicated with his mother from that point on. He never spoke to her through the hearing trumpet ever again. She absolutely loved it, because for the first time in years, someone was speaking to her without yelling through a black tube, and it just happened to be her son, which made it that much more special. This is Eliza in later years. She actually lived to be 85, which is incredible. If you made it past 70 in their day, you were doing really well. And when Eliza emigrated, she was 60. So she was already looking towards her senior years. And again, this is a lady who married what would have been considered late in life, did not see her mother pass away because she was still in Scotland when she died from breast cancer, lost 2 sons and a grandson, emigrated at age 60, lived on a farm for 11 years, and eventually they moved to Washington, D.C., where Alec and his wife were living, and she and Melville retired there, and she was able to take the later part of her life quite easy and living a little more comfortably. But I just think she's an incredible lady. Her artwork clearly was an outlet for her. It gave her a chance to escape the travails of life. But again, take a look. She's holding that hearing trumpet. She carried it everywhere. To me, she looks incredibly grandmotherly here. I think if that one grandson had survived, she would have doted on him incredibly. She got to dote on 2 granddaughters. Alexander and his wife Mabel had 2 daughters. But essentially, she continued helping to look after Melville until the day she died. And I suspect she probably loved it. And Alec was heartbroken, to say the least, when his mother passed away. They had a very close bond, given that he was the only surviving of the 3 sons. And this is Melville and Eliza. This is at a summer home that they owned. And again, it always amazes me. You know, we talk about age difference when people are starting relationships. And when we do tours here and say that Melville and Eliza were 10 years apart and Eliza was the elder of the 2, people are a little shocked. And you know, to tell them, you know, that wasn't unusual in that time period. You know, people are still surprised. But if you look at them here, you wouldn't know there was any age difference. They aged very gracefully together. Again, Melville is 10 years younger than Eliza here, but you would never know that. And Eliza was, again, a super gentle lady, and I think she carried that through to the end of her life. Well, now we're going to move on a little bit to a lady that came into Alexander's life. His mother had to actually step aside a little bit, as she very much admitted in one of her letters. So Alec taught in Boston. So he would teach at the School for the Deaf in Boston. He was also teaching privately. He'd come home to Brantford for the summers and again at holiday time. But in 1874, a gentleman named Gardner Hubbard approached Alec about tutoring his 15-year-old daughter, who had lost her hearing as a result of scarlet fever when she was 5 years old. Her name was Mabel. She was born in 1857. She was 10 years younger than Alec. She was the 4th child of Gardner and Gertrude Hubbard. Gardner Hubbard was a patent attorney at the time. And when she contracted scarlet fever, it completely obliterated her hearing. Now, keep in mind, at this point in time, there are no institutions for the deaf in all of North America that teach anything but sign language. The Hubbards didn't want their daughter to lose the ability to speak. As a 5-year-old, she could talk. And so what they did was send her to Germany for a year, where there was a school for the deaf. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold going on. So Mabel went to a school for the deaf in Germany, where she continued to learn speech. And while she was there, not only did her English improve, but she learned German as well, having probably never heard a word of it before that. She came back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the Hubbards lived. And by the time she was 15, she was certainly speaking. She also did not want to be known as someone that had a physical affliction. She did not wish to be put in an institution. She didn't wish to be singled out. But the problem was that her pronunciation skills had grown poor. Mabel had not heard her own voice in 10 years. So Alec hired Alec as a tutor to help her with her speech. And within 6 months, he had her speaking well enough. Most people didn't know she was deaf. In that time, they were spending a lot of time together, not just as teacher and student, but he and Mabel became very good friends. He was welcomed into the Hubbard home in Cambridge, Massachusetts as a visitor. And by the time Mabel was 17, so 2 years after they had met, he was head over heels in love with her. Now, at this point in time, a proper gentleman did not just ask a girl out on a date. His first step was to go to her parents to ask permission to court their daughter. And Mrs. Hubbard at the time said no. Alec was 27, Mabel was 17. Again, she wasn't worried about the age difference, but she didn't want any of her daughters to have suitors until they were 18. So she asked Alec not to say anything to Mabel for the better part of a year, which he agreed to. That lasted 3 months. He figured out pretty quickly that her sisters knew what was going on, and he was afraid they'd tell Mabel how he felt. He wanted to be the one to tell her that he loved her. At this point, she was with her cousin on holiday. He boarded a train, he went there, and he confronted her. First, he sent her a letter, and then she agreed to meet him, and he told her he loved her, taking her completely off guard. She had no clue. She was very fond of him, but she wasn't in love at this point. This is a young girl who has probably had a bit of a sheltered life, thanks to her deafness. She has never had suitors, but she was also very mature for her 17 years, and she is the one that suggested that they spend more time together. She felt she needed to get to know him even better. So essentially, they were courting. And within a few months, he had won her over, and they were engaged. Her father agreed to let them marry in July of 1877. And when I say that, it's because Gardner Hubbard became one of the principal financial backers in the telephone scheme. He refused to allow them to marry until the telephone was in commercial use and there was some sort of income. So in July of 1877, they married at Mabel's family home in Massachusetts, and then immediately boarded the train and came up to Brantford so that Melville and Eliza could meet their new daughter-in-law. On the way, as you do, they stopped in Niagara Falls, and they had their wedding portraits taken there. And this is actually Mabel's wedding photograph. Mabel actually strongly disliked Niagara Falls. She could see them, she couldn't hear them, but she could feel the rumble of the falls underfoot. And it really distressed her. It made her very uncomfortable. She refused to go back after that point. They came up to Brantford, and the first thing Eliza did to her new daughter-in-law was break an oat cake over her head as she was coming through the front door of the house, which is a Scottish tradition to ensure that the married couple will always have food on their table. Alec forgot to tell Mabel what his mother was likely to do, and all that Mabel understood was that her new mother-in-law was throwing food at her as she came into the house. So Mabel got very upset, thinking she had done something wrong to upset Mrs. Bell, and Alec had to try and settle her and explain to her what it was that was happening. Alec and Mabel then went to England for their honeymoon. Alec really wanted Mabel to see where the family had been, where the family came from. So they started out in Scotland. They eventually ended up in London. It was a learning experience for Mabel, especially in Scotland, because keep in mind, she was part of a family that was very upper class American. Her mother believed in a coming out for their daughters. They had servants. It was probably a little more Downton Abbey-like than it would have been for the Bells here at the farm. And even when Mabel was here for the first time, her letter to her mother is actually quite hilarious, because tongue-in-cheek, you can tell Mabel is a little unsure of this family, because after the big celebration party they had for the newly married couple, she came down in the morning and all the empty champagne bottles were lined up in the front hall, and this is just something that she would never have seen before. But Alec was determined that they were going to survive on their own in Scotland, and they rented a cottage on the seashore, and he fished, and Mabel was to cook the fish. And again, the letters from Mabel to her mother about this experience are actually really hilarious, because Mabel probably hadn't done much cooking. She certainly had never cleaned fish before, so it was a learning curve for her. But when they went to England, she actually got pregnant with their first daughter. And the doctor at the time did not want them making the overseas trip back to the United States while she was pregnant. So they stayed actually for almost 1.5 years. And their oldest daughter, Elsie, was born there. And Elsie in this photograph is on Mabel's right. And she was named after her grandmother. Elsie is another version of Eliza. In between that, so they did come back to North America. Alec really wanted to settle here in Brantford near his parents, but he was already being thrown into patent litigation over the telephone with the Western Union Telegraph Company. So they ended up staying and moving to Washington, where he needed to be. Her parents by that point were in Washington as well. And during those first couple of years, Mabel lost 2 sons. So the first was premature and his lungs collapsed. The second one lived for a little bit, but then he passed away as well. So she lost her sons. She and Alec lost their sons, rather. But in 1880, very happily, they had a daughter named Marion, and she's sitting there in between her parents. This was at the time when Alec had developed what he called the photophone, which was a device that would transmit sound over a beam of light. Today we call it fiber optics. Alec had already started venturing into this as early as 1880, and he did succeed in getting it to work. And he was so excited about getting it to work that when Marion was born, he wanted her named Photophone. Thankfully, Mabel interceded and said, not in a million years. And so she was named after Mabel's sister, Marion, who unfortunately passed away quite young. But to Alec, Marion was always known as Daisy. And here's another photo of Mabel taken at about this time. She was always very stylish. She always wore whatever was in fashion at any given time. And of course, if you look at her here, there's not much waist going on there. She's wearing the 18-inch, she's got the corset underneath that's bringing everything into 18 inches. This is, oh, that's not good. Let's do this, see if it clears. There we go. This is a little bit later on, of course. Her father had actually started the National Geographic Society. He was the founder of the NGS. And when he passed away, Mabel and her mother were adamant they did not want the society to just disappear. Gardner Hubbard had managed it more as a gentleman's club that met once a month. They had their own publication, which was very dry and boring as far as Alec was concerned, but they were determined that Alec should be the next president of the National Geographic Society. And he reluctantly took it on, saying that he would only do it if he was given full power to do whatever he wanted with the publication. And his big thing was introducing it to the public at large and making sure there were lots of photographs in that publication. So the National Geographic magazine that we know today is a result of his influence. This is actually one of my favorite photos because it's here. So in 1917, the Bell Memorial downtown was unveiled and the homestead was officially deeded to the city. And this is a photo of Alec and Mabel here on October 24th, the day of that dedication, at the edge of the bluff overlooking the river. And this is actually where a bit of confusion came about, because if you look behind Alec, there's a birch tree. And at the time, I'm very confident that what he was telling the reporters and everyone there was, this was my dreaming place, meaning the bank of the river, not meaning the birch tree. The birch tree was actually what his father called the eagle's nest. His father had put a seat in the middle of the three trunks of the tree so that you could sit there and look out over the river. But for years, people assumed this is where he invented the telephone. And it was a disaster, I'm sure, when the land eroded behind the homestead and that tree was gone. But it was not the tree. It was the bank along the river that Alec had his dreaming place. But Mabel and Alec traveled all over the world with the National Geographic. They did a world trip later in life and eventually built a summer home in Nova Scotia. Alec hated Washington, D.C. The summers in Washington, the humidity absolutely killed him. It brought back the headaches that he typically suffered from, which, by the way, it was never proven that he had tuberculosis. The belief now is that he suffered from migraine headaches. And of course, humidity brought them all back on for him. And while traveling the East Coast, they stopped in the village of Bedeque and he fell in love with it. And they started buying up land on what's called Redhead and built their summer home there, which is still owned by the Bell descendants to this day. And this is a photograph of Alec and Mabel there. At Benvria, as they call it, which means beautiful mountain in Gaelic, Mabel and the two girls kind of let their hair down. If you look at what Mabel's wearing here, she's just being comfortable now. The girls were allowed to wear trousers. They were allowed to wear knickerbockers. They didn't have to wear their dresses while they were there. They could go barefoot. And as they married and their children came about, the same thing occurred. Mabel really kind of didn't follow convention necessarily while they were out there. And they both loved the place. Alec passed away there in 1922. Mabel was so lost without him that she passed away 5 months later in 1923. So as she got older, she supported him incredibly. And as some of you may know, his work went on to include aerial experiments in Nova Scotia, resulting in the first manned powered flight into the British Empire, known as the Silver Dart in 1909. Mabel was the financial support for that. She provided the money for what became the Aerial Experiment Association. She put up with a lot with her husband. He had many quirks and habits that his mother dealt with and later Mabel dealt with. Probably the worst being his nighttime habits. He never went to bed before 2 o'clock in the morning and then would sleep in till noon the next day, which of course threw off morning breakfast, noontime dinner. If people were coming for noontime dinner, he was being roused out of bed and didn't want to get up. So she had her challenges with her husband, but again, by the time he passed away, not only was she deaf, but she was going blind and she had pancreatic cancer. And so after he passed, she decided, that's it, I'll finish up what I need to, and she died the next January. And they're both buried at the top of the mountain at Benvria. Very happily, though, as I mentioned, they went on to have 2 daughters. So here we have Elsie on the right, Daisy or Marion on the left. They both married, and in fact, Elsie's husband became the first editor of the National Geographic magazine under Alec's tutelage, and later the president. And when they started courting, again, Mabel was like her mother. She wanted her daughters to have a proper debut and wanted them to be out in society as they did at the time. Elsie was all about that. And Gilbert Grosvenor, who became her husband, was a perfect match for her in that respect. Daisy was more of a vagabond. She wanted to go live with artists in Greenwich Village. She eventually went to Paris for a while and studied art there. But she was introduced eventually to a young botanist named David Fairchild. And Fairchild was eventually, through the US government, sent on a worldwide trip to find plant materials that could come back to North America to help feed people. One of the things that he's known for is bringing avocados, lemons, and cherry trees. So if you've ever been to Washington and seen the cherry trees, you can thank David Fairchild for those. He's the one that brought them to Washington. So they eventually did marry. The two sisters, although adored each other, they had 10 children between them. They were very different. Elsie was very much more like Mabel's side of the family, putting on the public shows at times. Marion was more down to earth. In Bedeque, people, it wasn't unusual to find her just going and sitting on someone's veranda for the afternoon to have tea and chat. And she was far more down to earth in that respect, very much like her father. But to finish up, I do have some more photos here. So this is Elsie and Gilbert Grosvenor when they came to visit the homestead in the 1960s before she passed away. They were here a couple of times. She unveiled the statue of her father at the Bell Building on Market Street in 1948. And here are David and Marion out at Bedeque. And so the Bells actually built two homes at Bedeque. The first house is called the Lodge. It's more of a rustic 2-story cabin. And eventually they needed something bigger to host a lot of visitors. So they built what's known as the Point, which is more of a mansion. And when it came time to divide up the two houses between the sisters, Elsie and Gilbert actually got the Lodge at first, and Marion and David got the Point. They agreed to switch because Elsie Elsie had 7 children and Daisy only had 3. So it made sense that the larger family get the bigger house. But Marion was probably far happier in the Lodge. It was far more in character for her. One of Elsie's daughters, I was fortunate enough to meet. Her name was Mabel Grosvenor. She was born in 1905, one of 7 children of Elsie and Gilbert Grosvenor, and one of 5 women in the 1930s to graduate from Johns Hopkins University as a physician. Growing up, she spent a lot of time with her grandfather. In fact, when she was a teenager, she became his secretary. So he was insistent on recording everything. Having gone through so many patent hearings over the telephone and needing to prove himself time and time again, he made sure anything he did was recorded. And for a few years, Mabel was his secretary and followed him around, traveled with him. She was here when the homestead was dedicated to the city in 1917. But her passion was medicine. And so she became a pediatrician. She never married. She was very much a spinster. She always said that her patients were her children. In the 1960s, when her parents started to fail, she was the one to look after them. She eventually inherited.
Right. Are you able to wrap up within a few minutes?
Yep, almost done.
Okay, great. Thanks.
She eventually became the owner of the Point, the large house at Benvria. And so she really became the matriarch of the family in many ways, but she was revered by dozens of nieces and nephews over the years. This is her here. This is when they were here for the dedication. That's her as a young girl. I met her in the late 1990s, and we developed a really good friendship in that whenever I went to Bedeque, I'd go to visit her. She always expected me to come up and have tea with her, and I could ask her anything. We used to call her the encyclopedia. She had all the family answers. And I asked her if she remembered coming to the homestead in 1917. And at this time, the caretakers for the museum lived in the house. So all that was really seen was the front hall. And she described it to a T, which I thought was amazing. But she could answer any questions about her family. She lived to be 101. I actually visited with her 2 weeks before she passed away. She was super interested in the homestead. She wanted to know what we were doing and how things were going. And she was just a lovely woman. And I miss her a lot because, you know, there's always questions come up that we know Dr. Mabel would have been able to answer. But yeah, she lived a good long life. And when you think about everything she would have seen, experienced in those 101 years, she saw a lot of world history transpire over that time period. So there's a reason why we called her the encyclopedia. So I'm just going to finish up. I'm going to unshare my screen. I said I had some goodies to show you. So I'm going to grab my gloves here. These are all things that pertain primarily to Eliza. So first of all, I will show you her original hearing trumpet. Now, I won't even ask if anyone here today wears a hearing aid, but if you had been around 100 years ago, this is what you would have been carrying with you everywhere you went if you had hearing loss. So this is one of Eliza's original rubber hearing trumpets that we have here at the homestead. That's the end for speaking. That's the end that goes in the ear. So to use it, Eliza would have been essentially carrying it like this and holding it out to you, and you'd be talking, if not yelling into it for her. As I said, Melville adored his wife, and for their 17th wedding anniversary, he had a special collar brooch made for her. I'll see, can everyone see that? It is super special because the design that's in it is made up of locks of hair from all three of their sons. So in there are locks of hair from Melly, Alec, and Ted. And then in the back, Melville has actually written, I don't know how well you can see it, it's kind of dark here, but he wrote her a very lengthy poem, which is in the back of the brooch. And from what we can tell, we have never seen a photograph of her wearing it. We have a feeling she might have just kept it for safekeeping, put away, because it's all she had left of the two boys that passed away in 1868 and 1870. And then finally, let's see, these are two of her miniature paintings. So that is a portrait she painted of her mother, Mary White. And then over here is her father, Dr. Samuel Simons. And I know it's hard to see on the screen, but the detail is absolutely incredible. So these are painted on ivory. All right. So thank you so much again for having me. As you know, I like to talk about this family. I keep telling people as I get older, if you know my memory starts to go, I'm sure I'll be able to talk about the Bells still. I probably won't know who I am, but I'll be able to talk about the Bell family, no problem. So again, thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try and answer.